Good evening and welcome to this special evening at the Inner River Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Durham, North Carolina. I'm Reverend Daniel Trollinger, Executive Minister here. For those viewing on the live stream, welcome. Our lead minister, Reverend Jacqueline Brett, is regrettably unable to be here due to illness. She sends her best wishes, and along with the rest of us, we would like to welcome back to ERUF Reverend Dr. Arvid Straube. He served as the lead minister here for over 20 years and is now our minister emeritus. He will begin the evening with his talk, The Death and Resurrection of Unitarian Universalism, which will be followed by responses from Reverend Dr. James Kubal-Komoto, lead minister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Raleigh, and Reverend Lisa Garcia-Sampson, Executive Director of the UU Justice, North Carolina. At the end of the presentations, we'll have time for questions, and we'll have some mics down here. So, without further ado, Arvid.
Wow, it's good to be back. I see a studio back there that says on air. That's cool. I never thought finally get to experience that here. That's wonderful. So I've been thinking about this topic before I start actually reading the paper. I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. COVID really accelerated my thinking around this. And so the paper will explain some things that happened to kind of focus my thinking. And I want this to be a conversation. This is the third draft of this paper I presented publicly. I'm trying to get this out as much as possible. I've changed it with some responders. Last week I did this at a regional ministers meeting. There's some great conversation about that. I'm hoping for some of that here. I would like you, those of you who disagree, to come up to the mic and do so nicely. And those of you, so I want this to be a conversation that continues. I already know some different things I'm going to put in here for the next iteration of this paper. So here goes. If current trends continue, by 2035, 2/3 of our congregations will be gone. Why do I say this? Last year, a major study was released that clarified what observers have been saying for years. The study is called Faith Communities Today 2020. We can put up the, well, maybe we can share the link to that so you can look at the data yourself. Hartford Seminary studied 15,000 faith communities. And these were not just Christian communities. They were Mormons, Jews, Muslims, Unitarian Universalists, Buddhists. I don't think Jehovah's Witnesses, but in short, almost all varieties of religious communities. About half of those communities were studied, and this just happened before the pandemic, and the other half in the early months of the pandemic. So that was an interesting comparison they were able to make. Here is what they found that leads to my conclusion about the death of 2/3 of Unitarian Universalist congregations. This is general, 15,000 communities. They found that 2/3 of the congregations were declining. In the last 20 years, since they last did a study like this, the median decline in participants was around 50%. These congregations, these 2/3, had an average age of well over 50, with fewer young people and children. The older age of a congregation and its leaders equals decline. They're being kept alive by generous donations and generous volunteer efforts. But someday soon, the last 95-year-olds will die and the congregations with them. The UU congregations that were part of this study haven't been broken out yet for analysis, as far as I know. But it is not hard to see that this is the story of our congregations as well. Last year, one denominational leader, addressing a gathering of UU ministers, advised that most of us were engaged in what would best be described as a ministry of palliative care for the congregations we serve. Now, in medicine, my understanding, there's doctors here, some a little bit, but in medicine, palliative care is distinct from hospice care in a number of ways. Palliative care is for illnesses that are serious and complex, yes. And yes, most people on palliative care do die fairly soon, but palliative care focuses less on cure and more on quality of life of the patient, and this often results in rates of survival that are longer, even much longer than expected. The same could be true for our declining congregations. To quote the study, small does not mean ineffectual, but it does mean a part-time leader, older members, less vibrant worship, and diminished ministry efforts. For those older members, these congregations can be and will continue to be, for some years, a vital and cherished part of the lives of their participants. And I could cite examples of congregations that were close to extinctions but have found a new life by embracing a radically new vision and direction. There's the bad news. So here's the good news. About a third of the congregations that were studied are thriving and growing. So this whole story about how organized religion is just declining, it's not true across the board. A third of these 15,000 congregations that were studied are thriving. They're growing in membership and in programs, and these thriving congregations have a number of characteristics in common, and these are the ones we should pay attention to. So there's a broad range of traditions that were studied. Some have very rigid liturgical requirements. This is how you do worship Sunday after Sunday, or Friday after Friday, or Saturday after Saturday. Others have an anything-goes style of worship, but they all have worship services that are perceived as vital and engaging. Quoting the study, worship must address daily felt needs and be congruent with lived reality. It must stimulate an emotional and passionate response and motivate participants to live out their faith every day. Unquote. These congregations also support and motivate people to engage in, quote, personal and family faith practices. So that's the number one common characteristic, is vital, passionate worship that addresses people's daily felt needs. Another thing that these congregations have in common is that they're willing to change to meet new challenges. They are flexible and can act quickly to address challenges and take advantage of opportunities. And this includes the use of a lot of technology. Hi. Okay. And these congregations almost always have an outreach to the larger community. The average age in these communities is younger than the declining two-thirds by a good bit. And to me, the most surprising finding, was that the vast majority of these congregations were multiracial, which was defined in the survey as having at least 20% of the participants being of a different racial group than the dominant group in that particular faith community. So multiracial in this definition was 20% of the participants were not in the dominant racial group of that particular group, congregation. In other words, the participation in these groups more greatly mirrors the larger society. It seems to me that the lower average age, this isn't in the survey, this is one of my thoughts, it seems to me that the lower average age and the multiracial makeup of these congregations go together. Younger generations grew up in an environment that is much more diverse than older generations. Data from the Public Religion Research Institute makes clear that almost all decline among Christians in the United States is among white Americans. The survey does see a positive potential in the fact that congregations have had to change the less effective ways that they've always done things in order to respond to the challenges of the COVID pandemic. An observation of Unitarian Universalist congregations shows me that the majority of UU congregations fit the pattern of the 2/3 of the congregations that are in decline. The average age of the vast majority of participants in the majority of our congregations reflect the life experiences and viewpoints of people in their 60s and older, the boomers. These congregations are also overwhelmingly white. That means that these people grew up in a culture where unconscious white privilege and the normative view of whiteness was the norm. And thus, the majority of our congregations do not mirror the larger culture today. Getting members of this generation to recognize and challenge this unrecognized privilege has proven to be a difficult and frustrating part of our movement's anti-racism work. This work, however, must continue if our movement and its congregations have a chance to thrive in the future, even though it is difficult work and the path ahead is not always clear. ERUF is a growing congregation. I just want to add, I looked at the pictures of the new members, younger than the average. Good, okay. ERUF is a growing congregation and is becoming more interracial. I've been impressed with the comprehensive and ongoing anti-racism work that the congregation is doing. Reverend Jacqueline told me about the programs that you're engaged in right now. I think that's great. The subtitle of my 1979 Doctor of Ministry thesis was The Inseparability of Spiritual Growth and Social Action. This has become a theme of my entire 40-plus years of ministry since. Social justice efforts are most effective when combined with practices that lead to the growth of the whole person, relationally, spiritually, and ethically. I welcome the fact that we are finally recognizing ways in which we've been blind to white privilege, homo and transphobia, and structural oppressions in our society and in our congregations, and we are finding this work to be difficult. However, we need to do it. It is deep soul work. Success will require an increase in deep listening, in compassion, humility, and deep respect for each other despite our differences. While social justice issues and concern have always been a part of our identity as Unitarian Universalists, and even before as Unitarians and Universalists, it has taken up a larger and larger part of the Unitarian Universalist landscape in the past few years. This is to the point, this is one of my more controversial points, this is to the point where the concerns for personal development, spiritual growth, and authentic community have, it seems at times, become secondary in a lot of our denominational organizations and in many congregations. A look at the workshop schedule of recent General Assemblies will reveal workshops that deal with a large variety of social and environmental justice concerns, and few, if any, dealing with theology, spirituality, and religious community. A quick look at the UUA website seems sometimes that we're more a social justice organization than a religious organization with a faith-based outreach to the larger world. Inseparability of the two. The faith community study identifies as a characteristic of those that are thriving the ability to quickly adapt, to take advantage of opportunities and face challenges. The culture in Unitarian Universalism of consensus building and long processing of our decisions by many small groups, lots of newsprint, many meetings, makes it difficult for our congregations to make necessary changes quickly enough. This consensus culture is, ironically, very conservative, because the defenders of the status quo and those with strong self-interests can dominate and defeat efforts at innovation and adaptation. Long and burdensome decision-making processes require a large amount of time for those who want to participate, time that many are reluctant or unable to give, and those who can find it boring. There's also, in many congregations, a reflective mistrust of authority. As former UU President Peter Morales has said, we savage our leaders and call it democracy. Many congregations, in order to survive, will need a clear, streamlined, accountable, and trusted leadership structure, but one that can act decisively. Congregations of all flavors were already declining before the COVID crisis. The pandemic has only accelerated this process. The study points out that this has led to opportunities as well as challenges. Congregations that had been slow to adapt have had to adapt. Greater use of technology has become a must. I don't know of any UU congregations that don't have multi-platform worship now. It could be hoped that many of the innovations that were required have convinced enough people in enough congregations to see the advantages of innovation to revitalize their congregations' ministries. It is also true in this moment of Unitarian Universalism that the stress of the pandemic has led to conflict and an unprecedented exodus of parish ministers from their positions and even their ministerial careers. Did you all know about that? It's a big time exodus of ministers in our movement. And that's true at other movements too. The anxiety of the multiple crises of the last several decades has been transferred to and has flowed through our faith communities, increasing the anxiety within the emotional system of those institutions. The faith communities today's study shows that what we need to do to help our congregations survive and thrive. Unfortunately, change is difficult. A colleague of mine just preached a sermon last week, said, "Change is difficult, you first." You know, it's not natural. And I think, I hate to be ageist, I'm going to risk it. I think it's less natural for the older we get, in particular, to embrace and tolerate change. Many congregations will choose to continue current practices, ones established in a very different world where these senior members were young. These congregations can still be important. They can be a wonderful circle of friendship and support, but their days as an institution are numbered. I believe that the first thing to understand is to be clear about what the mission of our congregation should be. We should be helping people of all ages be whole, compassionate, authentic, and striving human beings. That should come first. We should be about creating whole people whose healed lives help heal the world. This does not mean we ignore the work of peace and justice in which we're engaged, but by themselves, these are not the prime mission of our faith, because that justice work will be done more effectively by those who are spiritually mature, grounded in their values, compassionate, and wise. That work will be better done when we understand and are grounded in the values of our rich theological heritage. The times we live in requires courage, and so does the life of our congregations. We begin by knowing that we must meet the felt lived experience of those in our midst. We begin by honoring and supporting their sacred desires for greater integrity, for loving relationships, for a deep sense of being at home in themselves and in the world. That includes the desire to compassionately reach out to those who are suffering and to the cries of our planet. Our programs, worship, and example should help our members and friends learn to be awesome human beings and authentic human beings. And we don't know how to do that exactly. All of our customary assumptions and practices are up for grabs, Many, while they may have been effective, are now counterproductive, and they have been counterproductive for a while. So there needs to be the courage to experiment, to try different things, and to take those bold risks and be willing to fail, because we can't innovate without failing sometimes. We've just got to try things, see what works, listen to our stakeholders, look at successful innovations by our congregations in the wider movement and by other traditions for inspiration. We should be deeply aware of the context, the particular context in which, in which our congregations are located, because everyone is going to be different and the needs are going to be different. We need to pay attention, as I said, to all the potential stakeholders, and not just the current members and not just the current leaders. Much of the vital work of our faith right now is taking place outside of congregational settings. I think about the ministries of our camp and conference centers, and such innovative ministries as Black Lives UU, which provides a spiritual home for a lot of Black Unitarian Universalists that they haven't been able to find in our local congregations. We can be grounded in the deepest yearnings of our members. We can listen to that which breaks our hearts and then respond wisely and compassionately. To encourage us to be the best people we can be is actually exciting. It's a great adventure. It's really fun, and it's fulfilling. And that's really what we were meant to do. Thank you. James.
Good evening, everybody. And Arvid, thank you for inviting me to be a respondent to your thought-provoking and wonderful paper. I want to start my response by telling a story about coffee. I first went to college in the late 1980s at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And there were many... Oh, yeah, okay, good. There were many good coffee shops that served high-quality coffee. My favorite was the Daily Grind, though the coffee shop in the basement of the Unitarian Universalist campus ministry building, the Red Herring, had pretty good coffee too. But when I went back to my parents' home in the Chicago suburbs, it was hard to find good coffee. Never mind the swill-like, freeze-dried Folgers instant coffee that my parents drank. It was hard to go out and find good coffee. It seemed like all over the country, people were willing to put up with mediocre tasting coffee, had done so for all of their lives, and nobody even knew how to pronounce cappuccino. Soon, all of that changed. Starbucks went public in 1992 and started its huge expansion. Soon there were Starbucks everywhere, as well as even better locally owned coffee shops, and people weren't willing to put up with mediocre tasting coffee anymore. And so other places started to upgrade the quality of the coffee they were serving as well. Soon you could get a half-decent cup of coffee at McDonald's. Even convenience stores and gas stations upped their game. Places that didn't lost customers or went out of business. Something similar has happened in the American religious landscape. For decades, most Americans were willing to put up with mediocre church because there was social pressure to attend church somewhere. But now, in most parts of the country, it is socially acceptable not to go to church. I'm not sure when we reach the tipping point, but we have reached the tipping point. And as a result, people are no longer willing to put up with mediocre church. And churches, as well as synagogues, mosques, and temples that don't up their game are losing customers and going out of business. Thousands of churches close every week in this country, and this was even before the pandemic. The pandemic sped this up when millions of people realized how nice not going to church was. How they didn't miss it. Unless church adds real value to their lives, most people, especially overworked working age people, would rather sleep in on Sunday mornings, or at least sleep until they have to take their 8-year-old to an 11 a.m. soccer game. But where will people get their spiritual and religious needs met? Most likely through some kind of cafeteria-style mix and match of yoga classes, Brene Brown TED Talks, meetups, and other opportunities. I just got back from a 5-day intensive for a spiritual direction training program. I guess about half of the people there will never become spiritual directors, but are just there for their own spiritual growth. That program has become their church. And there are so many other programs, conferences, camps, and other gatherings like this sprouting up all over the country. Young people today are the least religious generation in decades, yet thousands of them flocked to a revival in February in Kentucky from all across the country. How many of you heard about that revival? Yeah. People today are just as spiritually hungry, if not more so, than ever before. So I am in complete agreement with Arvid and the Faith Communities Today report that points to 2/3 of our congregations closing. The only slight quibble that I have is to say that many won't close completely, but many will become house churches. Small congregations, like cockroaches, are hard to kill off completely. I'm not optimistic that many will avoid that fate, because most of them are meeting the needs of their current longtime members who aren't motivated to change. For those congregations who don't wish to die, I couldn't agree more with Arvid when he calls for more congregations to be willing to embrace change, finally deal with their authority issues, abandon overly democratic decision-making structures, and especially balance spiritual growth with social justice commitments. I look forward to the day that Unitarian Universalist congregations have spiritual growth curricula for children and youth that are as comprehensive as our sexuality education curricula. People are thirsty. People are thirsty for a rich, dark, aromatic brew of spirituality, connection, meaning, depth, and growth. And too many of our congregations are serving something weak, stale, and tepid at best, and cold and acrid at its worst. If somebody is really interested in really long meetings where people are obsessed with Robert's Rule of Order, there is always the local county Democratic Party. I might add one other thing. In the future, since congregations will likely have declining congregational budgets, contributions to denominations, including the UUA, will decrease as well. So in the future, I expect an even more drastic decline in UUA services. However, that doesn't mean that any one congregation simply has to go it alone. Here in the Triangle, we have 3 medium to large-size growing congregations. This congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Raleigh, where I serve, and the Community Church of Chapel Hill. I expect that if these 3 congregations are going to continue to thrive, we will need to learn how to work more cooperatively than ever before. Even more importantly, if Unitarian Universalism is going to survive in other parts of North Carolina, it will be up to congregations like these three, rather than the UUA, to give them the support that they need. Let me finish by saying one thing. I read the Faith Communities Today report, and I wasn't surprised by the list of the shared characteristics of the 1/3 of congregations that were growing. There is nothing surprisingly new or radical in those shared characteristics. The things that these congregations are doing all fall under the category of what I simply call doing church well. Perhaps the most radical thing that any Unitarian Universalist congregation can do is not to embrace the latest fad or the latest proffered silver bullet from the latest so-called expert, present company not included. Perhaps the most radical thing that any Unitarian Universalist congregation can do is up our game and recommit ourselves to doing what we already know how to do as best we can, because people won't put up with mediocre church anymore. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Arvid. I obviously a few inches shorter than my colleagues today. I want to begin by thanking Reverend Arvid for his reflection, and I'm sorry that Reverend Jacqueline is sick and we won't get to hear her insights tonight, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to pinch hit for her and share my own reflections. So my first instinct is to respond as a millennial in the room. Am I the only millennial in the room? Oh, one in the back. All right, there we go. After all, there we go. Yeah, let's wave. Yeah. After all, it is within my lifetime that the percentage of people in the U.S. who do not affiliate with an organized religion has gone from 11 to nearly 30%. And as Reverend Arvid has pointed out about the average age of our congregations, it doesn't feel like a stretch to say that millennials will have a large impact on the future of Unitarian Universalism. Some who study the decline of religion do point to my own generation, the dastardly millennials, as the major cause of this change. And as James pointed out, some go even further to make the claim that faith and spirituality matter less to us than previous generations. Or perhaps you were alluding to that, perhaps. If your loyalties lie with an organized religion, then this is a very convenient assessment. It's not us, it's them. But others have come to a different conclusion. The Faith Matters survey of about 5 years ago found that among the religiously unaffiliated, most of them express some belief in God and even in the afterlife, and many of them say religion is important in their lives. And the same survey also tells us that young Americans view religion as judgmental and hypocritical, and large numbers say that they became unaffiliated because religious organizations are not spiritual enough. Looking deeper, it's not that millennials don't care about morality or spirituality. No, they're saying that churches are not fulfilling their spiritual and ethical needs. And that's an entirely different situation, isn't it? And in that sense, I think it's accurate to refer to this moment as an exodus, because for so many, leaving church is ironically an act of faith. In 2018, I received a grant to study the rise of the religiously unaffiliated and go on a road trip through the South to visit spiritual communities of all sorts where people were finding spirituality, justice, diversity, and connection. I went with my spouse, Ree, and we sought out innovative church models that reimagined traditional frameworks of organized religion. And we sought out distinctly non-church experiences. We met people who considered yoga and storytelling to be their spiritual practices, as James alluded to, people who lived out their morality through activism and education. Everywhere we went, people said, yeah, this right over here, this is where I feel connection. This is where my spirit comes alive. And all along the way, we asked, what can Unitarian Universalism learn from this? Can this help us to adapt? There are a few things I want to say here. First, it's really good news that my generation is so concerned with spirituality and morality. It means that we may be, or we may become, the place millennials are looking for. But that means we are also called to open ourselves to the many sources of wisdom in our world today. Not chasing fads, but recognizing what are the quality of experiences that speak to younger generations, and what does it mean to take that wisdom into church. We need to meet this moment with curiosity and willingness to change, as Arvid said, and even more than that, to interrogate the limits of our imagination for what Unitarian Universalism may look like in a half a century. Second, I want to quickly respond to Arvid from the view as the leader of our UU State Justice Ministry. I spent a fair number of hours today thinking about the points you made in regards to the emphasis on justice and your concern that it may be taking away from other essential congregational work like personal development, spiritual growth, and authentic community. And I want to keep digging in. I want to keep learning more about that. I want to be curious about that. But my initial instincts are to only caution against framing this from a place of scarcity, and to say that we can't do all these things well, which, Arvid, I don't believe you are saying. And that these parts of congregational life, as your doctoral thesis asserts, are deeply interconnected, and particularly when it comes to theology. I believe that the new emerging and the deepening of Unitarian Universalist theology is coming, perhaps even primarily in this moment, from our justice work. That we are called to deeper understandings of the transformative power of love. We've come to recognize our justice work and the interconnection of our faith and service to justice work as a place of spiritual transformation, movement as a place of spiritual home. We've come to understand through partnership, through COVID care for one another, a deeper sense of collective liberation. And so I want to make sure we keep justice as a core part of our theology and not as something separate. And again, Arvid, I don't believe you're saying that, but I want to be careful to make that note. And moreover, I think an outward emphasis on justice in the way that you described, you said you went onto the UUA website, looked at GA, and I agree. I think there is a very, very large emphasis on justice right now. One, I wonder if we were purely a business, if that would be the correct business choice. I actually think it would be for my generation. But two, I also think that an outward emphasis, and maybe too much of an emphasis right now, I don't know, on justice, is the natural, unavoidable consequence of a faith centered in love, being true to itself in today's unjust world. Finally, I want to respond from a historical perspective. While research and commentary over the past 15 years or so have made this feel like a sudden phenomenon, this do-or-die moment for our organized religion did not happen overnight. And the role of religion has been shifting, as James alluded to, in our country for a long time now. And we have encountered many other calls to evolve. Back 50, 60 years ago, the question was not if you belong to a church, but which one. Blue laws, state and federal blue laws, made sure you weren't going to movies, you definitely weren't buying alcohol, you definitely weren't driving your kid to a Sunday soccer game. All of that's changed now. Sunday's fair game for everything. Another shift we don't talk about enough is that in the 20th century, how the rise of women into the workforce impacted the life of churches. Suddenly, all of those women who were practically full-time volunteer staff for churches began their own careers. That was a huge shift for church. And back 50 years ago, there were fewer charities and causes competing for our donations. Now our money is more likely to be distributed among a wide range of things we love and believe in. And I could go on. A lot has changed. And of course, all these things I just named are great, right? They just undeniably created new challenges for churches. And this helped us to see how cultural systems were built to reinforce religion's place at the center of our society. Going even further back, if you'll indulge me, our Congregationalist ancestors had an even easier time sustaining their institutions. I used to work at First Church Boston. It was founded in 1630. The charter of the church is literally the charter of the city of Boston. So yes, they would absolutely be the only game in town. And in fact, when folks like Ann Hutchinson or Roger Williams started sharing new ideas, they were kicked out, and that's why we have Rhode Island. Everyone belonged to the church, and they had plenty of money, and they even had this great, I know it's pledge drive season right now. They had this amazing one-day pledge drive every year where they got all the money that they could ever need. Do you know what they called that day? Tax Day. They called it Tax Day. Because First Church Boston and many of our Unitarian congregations, many of our congregations were funded by state tax dollars until the 1830s. We had it good for a while, but pretty soon we found ourselves in changing times and with new competition. And in the 18th century, a new religious free market economy emerged, and soon Congregationalists were competing with other established churches like Episcopalians and Presbyterians in Boston, fighting for what our churches argued were our territory, our people. We were entitled to them, just as some churches today may feel like they are entitled to survive. And then we had itinerant preachers who rode into town, drawing huge crowds, preaching in new, emotional, exciting messages of salvation. And needless to say, we were pissed. Our country was changing, and understandably, we didn't want it to, because we had enjoyed such privileges since the early days of the United States. And instead of adapting to change, we fought it. And as a consequence, our Unitarian ancestors, the Congregationalists, went from having the highest percentage of itinerants nationally in 1776 to being near the bottom of the pack in 1850. That's what happens when you don't evolve. Scholars agree that this was due to an inability to cope with the consequences of religious freedom and the rise of a free market religious economy. And yet, it was in this period that we did change. Anchored by the core values of rationalism and freedom, many Congregationalist churches during this time eventually went on to embrace a new movement called Unitarianism. Our moment of great decline was also our moment of rebirth, of reinvention. So in short, we've been here before. America's religious free market economy has broken open again, this time into an even more diverse and expansive marketplace of spirituality and meaning-making. And as Reverend Arvid has said, I completely agree with this. We are in another do-or-die moment. I completely agree. But I am very hopeful that following a time of unprecedented innovation during the pandemic, and grounded in a theology that embraces evolution, we are well-positioned, perhaps uniquely positioned, not only to survive, but to be resurrected as a truer expression of our faith. I'm going to end with a quick story here. Back in 2018, my first stop on this road trip studying innovative religious communities was to a city that I had never been to before. It was a city. Ree and I came here to meet a Presbyterian minister named Ben. For the first 30 years of his career, he was a traditional parish minister. But then one night he had a dream. He literally had a dream to start a farm church. A church that is a small farm, and on Sunday morning, the first hour, the whole congregation farms the land, growing fresh produce to donate to the local community, and then all of them go into the barn for worship. When we sat down with him on 9th Street, we asked him, how did you ever have the courage to change so much of the traditional model of church? And I'll never forget what he told me. He explained that throughout his entire career, he would always try to put Jesus' message of service to our neighbors at the center of his ministry, but he found that in so many ways, the old church model got in the way of him doing that. So he created a new church where the entire mission was to help end food scarcity in Durham. Literally service to our neighbors. And he said that by putting the most important value at the center of the church, he felt newly liberated to let go of not all, but some of the parts of the traditional church model. His ministry evolved in a way that changed with the times, met the needs of his congregants, young and old, and lived into his Christian values in a deeper way than he had ever done before. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Resilient institutions can change with the times without changing who they are. And as Arvid concluded in his paper, we do that by knowing who we are, by discerning what is at the heart of ERUF, at the heart of Unitarian Universalism. Only we can answer that question for ourselves. But when we do, anchored in our identity, we can overcome the fear of an uncertain future and meet this moment with the spirit of ingenuity and possibility that is required. May that be our faithful response. We will change with the times without changing who we are, and we will be better for it. Thank you.
Would you help answer questions? Sure. Yeah, so in a minute, I'd like to invite those of you who have questions or comments to come up to one of these microphones and address it to any of us. I want to respond a little bit to your paper, because last week at a regional ministers meeting, I presented this paper, and one of my millennial colleagues made exactly the same point, well, almost the same point you made, which is that for many in our movement right now, the justice work, which is grounded in theology, that was the point I could have made better, was the path forward for spiritual growth. So my next iteration of that paper, I'm going to pay more attention to that. I just want to point out that the other millennial colleague made a similar point. We need to listen to that. So, okay, so who would like to come up to the mic?
Wow, I'm really short.
Come on over here.
No, I'm just seeing myself in the video.
They built his pulpit when I was a minister.
Go ahead. I could ask you a whole bunch of questions, so I'm going to stick to one.
Yeah, just get a little closer to the mic.
I'm touching it. Is that better? Okay. My name's Helen Wolfson. I'm a longtime member here. And I'm struggling to find the words for this, but except for when you talk about the spiritual needs of people, you talk about connection, you talk about meaning, you talk about community, blah, blah, blah. As a non-theist, I am drawn to those things. Spiritual, I'm not sure what you mean. I expect you all mean something slightly different, so I'm going to let that go. But as a radical movement, I would suggest that over the decades I've been here, I've heard our welcome change dramatically. And now there's, no matter whom you love, no matter what you identify as, no matter where you're from, no matter what your politics are, I would like to suggest that to appeal to the 30% or more of young people, we add no matter what gods you do or don't believe in. Because I don't think it matters, and we don't make that clear.
My name is Sarah Terry. Hi. Okay, my name is Sarah Terry, and I was getting to the point I think that you were making, Reverend Lisa, which is I agree that a lot of people come to this place and to this work with a goal for social justice. That's certainly what drew me here. I think some of the links that we need to make better as a church and as church leaders are that part of how do we make meaning out of that justice work, and what is the spiritual or ethical ways that work makes us grow. And so I see those as inextricably linked as opposed to one versus the other. And so I guess I'm interested in hearing if any of you have reflections on how either you or our churches or the UUA or the congregations generally can do a better job of making those connections to make that work, whether it's spiritual or ethical, as the root of why we do social justice work.
Well, you too, hopefully. That'd be great. So, so I was responding, maybe reacting is a better word. A lot of it, so when we talk about innovation and failing, some of our anti-racism work goes under that category. Some of the work that has been done had too much shaming involved, and there was a lot of sociological as opposed to theological discussion about this. So, and it doesn't have to be theist, Helen, to have a theological discussion about this, because we have a covenant theology, we have a theology of meeting together to converse and come to a new understanding and evolve our understanding. So those two have been very important. What has been lacking also, I think, and is coming back and needs to be part of a theology of social justice work, is forgiveness. And forgiveness can't happen without accountability. That's tough spiritual work right there. But I think that's what we need to do. So there has to be accountability, and there has to be a possibility of forgiveness, which is part of our Universalist tradition too. So.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. I mean, I think we're getting better at it. I've had the privilege of watching the way that, especially our National Side with Love team, has really skillfully begun the work of training us to ground our justice work in our theology, and this phrase of a theory of change, which is really critical to movement work and to organizing work, but a theory of change that is grounded in our faith. So in other words, what do we believe is the faithful response, the faithful way of being in the world? And do we actually have the faith that that has the power to change things? And continuing to move through this, again, as in this way that's this ever-evolving conversation. And that it's not going to be, sometimes I hear the sort of usefulness of an order of operation when it comes to doing this first, then doing that, and then getting into the justice work and preparing yourself and then being ready. And to a certain degree, I think there's room for that. But I also believe that getting tangled up in movement and relationship and not reading any more books that you don't feel, I'm not quite ready. I need one more book and I'll be ready. I think it's an embodied transformation that comes when you go to an event last night, Paige, you hug a friend and you realize the interconnection in the room. I think it happens when you have coffee with a friend and you talk about how we just expanded Medicaid, and you think, how did we do that? So I think it's in the minutia of movement. And it's not separate. It's a spiritual practice that accompanies the work of movement and feeds it. Yeah.
If I say the name James Luther Adams, is that a familiar name to a lot of people in the room? Okay, one of the most famous Unitarian Universalist theologians of the mid-20th century. In 1954, Adams presented a paper at Michigan State University in East Lansing, and he described a model for integrating social justice work and spirituality. And he talked about having small relational groups, and the requirement for each group was each person in the group had to have an individual spiritual practice, participate in the group, but also be involved in an outside organization devoted to social change. I think it's a formula that works. Arvid talked about his Doctor of Ministry project. Mine was how to motivate and sustain participation in social justice. And in doing my research, I found that the number one factor that distinguishes those in congregations that participate in social justice from those that don't is participation in some type of small relational group. That not only motivates participation in social justice, but it also helps people go deeper in their own spirituality. I know that when I preach on Sunday mornings, half of the things I say go in people's left ear and out their right ear, often by the time that they reach the parking lot. But the things that they talk about in their own spiritual group, in their small groups, we call them chalice circles, go really deep. So for me, small relational groups are one of the most important tools that we can use to integrate spirituality with social justice work.
Get rid of this. Michael Field, I have a toss-up question for all three of you. When I taught my fellow E-ruffians the history of UUism, I told them I would teach them the history, but it was irrelevant. What mattered is what UUism is today. So if you take your opening statistic, Arvid, and say 2/3 are going to go away, shouldn't we be redefining UUism at this time, setting it down 20 years into the future, and say, this is what it should be? And I'll ask the question, shouldn't we be doing that with the Article 2 rewrite? Is instead of doing a wordsmithing on 20 years ago's religion, shouldn't we be defining what we want to be 20 years out?
Couple things I want to say. That is,
Don't leave. You asked the question.
you could go to General Assembly and it isn't a done deal yet. I like it. I'll just say I like it. I think it's too wordy, and I don't disagree with hardly any of it, but it's really wordy. But I love the love at the center. I mean, I preached my last sermon in San Diego. I called it The Secret of Life, which is love. So yeah, I love that part. I was there in 1985 in Atlanta when we came up with these purposes and principles, and the 3 General Assemblies before, which were very contentious, and people didn't want to change anything of the old stuff, and now people are grabbing onto this. Our bylaws as association call for us to look at these from time to time because we are a living faith. So I don't have to agree with all of it. I think it is a democratic process. I don't have trouble with it. So you might have a different point of view. So.
I'm going to get myself into trouble here.
It's okay.
Yeah, we're online, right?
Yeah.
What the hell?
What could go wrong?
I treat most things coming out of the UUA with benign neglect. In my ministry, I have more important priorities. This congregation is a member of Durham Can, is that right? Yeah. UUFR is a member of One Wake, a sister organization. We're working really hard on affordable housing issues in Wake County. I'm going to put my energy there. I'm going to focus my folks' energy there. The UUA has never passed a bylaw change that has had any significant effect on the wider world. My energy and focus is going to be on the wider world.
Ooh, hot take. I think the only thing that I'll add is that I deeply trust the people in the room who did that beautiful Article 2 work. I trust them. I think that, and by the way, Paula Cole-Jones will be doing an event for North Carolina UUs on April 18th. She'll be talking about Article 2 and the 8th principle, and what we might expect at General Assembly. Yeah, I think that this is a great example of how evolution is baked into the culture of Unitarian Universalism, and I think what may be the more consequential thing for us to observe at General Assembly this year is how we react to change. Because if we tolerate Article 2, then Arvid's projections for 10, 15 years from now are even scarier. It's like when the interim minister comes into church and everybody's excited, and then, you know, she changes when the announcements are made in the service. And that cannot be the way forward. We've got to be more capable of change than we are right now. And so I think Article 2 is going to be a test in a lot of ways, and I think we should observe the way that we respond to change as much as anything. Yeah.
As I was listening, I'm Redford Williams. As I was listening to your very interesting talks, thank you very much sharing your ideas, all of a sudden occurred to me the results of a study I hadn't been aware of some years back. Thousands of people all over the country were questionnaire fill out, and they were looking for how religion might affect health and longevity. And would you believe that the number of times a year or a month, the frequency I attend church services or religious services was not associated with mortality at all? But the answer to the question, agreeing with the question, I really get a lot of emotional and spiritual support out of being a member and attending my services, was, yes to that, significantly higher longevity. Higher longevity. So it didn't matter so much how much you came, but whether you really got something out of it. And so what we need to do, as you all are, I think, all committed to, is to find things that will help people get emotional, spiritual, want to be here to get something out of it.
What's the humanist equivalent?
May it be so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Yeah.
Blessed be works too. All right. You got a question from our online audience?
Talk to James.
Susan Frederick Grace, the president of the UUA.
This is from Raquel Silva. Would it be possible for Reverend James to elaborate on the role of cooperation, coordination at different scales, congregation, regional, national? Would it be possible for Reverend James to elaborate on the role of cooperation, coordination at different scales, congregation, regional, national?
So here's what's happening. Most of the churches that are growing are larger churches. Yeah. Most, but not all, of the churches that are shrinking are smaller churches. What's commonly known as the pastoral-sized church in this country is disappearing. For the main reason is that churches of that size can simply no longer afford full-time ministry. And so churches that used to be able to afford a full-time minister can now only afford, a three-quarters-time minister, and then sometimes a half-time minister, and then sometimes no minister. And so all of these smaller congregations, the situation is becoming even more and more desperate. What I would really like to see is a chance where the larger, mid-sized to larger congregations in a region cooperate together. There's a lot that UUFR and Eno River could do together. We're not that far away. I live in Cary. I can get here almost as fast as I can get to my own congregation. There's a lot that we could do together that would save us resources, that would enhance our life together, that would make our social justice efforts together stronger. But even more than the cooperation between us, if these smaller congregations are going to survive, I love smaller congregations. I really do. They're special places. But if they're going to survive at all, they really need the help, and our congregations could become resource churches. We could hire a part-time minister, or we could hire an intern minister who could circuit ride to these small congregations. There's a dozen other things we could do. Chapel Hill has a good campus ministry program. Does this congregation have any kind of a campus ministry program? Yeah, and we don't either, and we have large universities nearby us. That's something that the three congregations should be working on together to create a Triangle Area campus ministry program. That will serve the next generation of Unitarian Universalists, help them meet their spiritual needs, get them involved with our statewide justice ministry and other social justice ministry efforts, and then we will have a good-looking future. So that's my vision. Have us work more closely together and help us be resources to all the smaller congregations. Thanks. Thanks for the question.
Could I share just one thing there? I think our state justice ministry also does play a big role in supporting our smaller congregations. And I think, we always talk about having the moral responsibility to do together what we cannot do alone. And I think bringing congregations together for efforts like UU the Vote is an absolutely perfect example of that. So we have congregations of 14 people, of 20 people, all the way up to churches of this size. And I think one of the things that we're most proud of is being able to operate as a resource. Every Tuesday, an email is in the inbox of every church in the state, and whether you have 14 people or 700, you know what's moving in the state legislature. You're connected to calls to action. Everyone has our Friday Action Hour event available to them. And in moments like UU the Vote, together we signed on, 20 congregations signed on to write a grant for $10,000. And together we wrote 35,000 postcards last year. And so all of our smaller congregations would not have had the capacity to do that individually, but together as a statewide justice ministry, it allows for a deeper level of engagement. And so I think that is hopefully a piece of the puzzle for the future as well. Yeah.
I'm Gabrielle Weinberger, and I love both of your comments, suggestions, and what you laid out about cooperating among our three large congregations, and Lisa, what you said about small congregations. But I was thinking we could also do a better job in a more personal connection with a specific small congregation and take on another congregation as part of our own and form real relationships, very much along the lines of what we do with small group ministry. Make it personal. Thanks.
Great discussion, and I know how I'm going to change this paper now, so a little bit to make it clear. This couldn't have been better, you guys. Let's give my colleagues a hand here. It's very thoughtful. I'd like to leave with us a good news story. The First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, a church that everybody said was dead. Back in the 30s and on, it was a huge congregation. It had a giant of a minister, giant in this fact that he was 6'6", and also very influential in the religious and political life of Los Angeles. One of the first ultra-humanist congregations we had, a big congregation, beautiful building in what is now Koreatown. And that building had become kind of an albatross. Their minister told the group there that they needed to sell the building and move. And they said no. And he left. And lay leaders in that congregation they just took over. And they made it a lay-led congregation. Now, it didn't have some of the ideas around the fellowship movement. They didn't know about the fellowship movement. They just made it up to meet their context. So this is a very, it's a community of a lot of Asian people, a lot of Latino people, and a lot of like younger people who can afford to live there and not elsewhere in LA. So of various races. So they decided they were not anti-minister, okay? I got invited several times to go up there and preach. I always loved it. There was just a great feeling of that place, a great spirit. Reverend James Ford is now there once a month, one of our friends that we have in common. There was a lot of joy there. They had the best 8-man choir I've ever heard. They would sing the church hymn in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Korean. Although I didn't know, there weren't any Korean people, but there were lots of Latino people. There was a interpretation of the service in the back if you weren't fluent in English. And there was always somebody who would teach a word in Spanish. And there was almost always a lunch afterwards, pay if you can. There was a food pantry they had. But the feeling in that place was just alive. And people were having fun. And they felt that they were encouraged. And I was there right before COVID to preach, and they had a new member recognition. This was in May. They had 14 new members. 2 of them were over 50. Think about that. And they said that, this is May, in February, it was a similar situation with welcoming new members. They looked at where they were. They looked at who the people were in that neighborhood. They looked at who had talents to bring, and they invited them to bring those talents. And they used resources from everywhere. Ministers love to go there. You know, and they have now 2 ministers who come monthly. Reverend James Ford is not only a UU minister, but also a Zen master. And they have a Black Baptist minister who comes once a month. And so the congregation is they've got some old lefties. I mean, the real thing, okay? And then they've got lots of younger people. They've got lots of immigrants from Central America and Mexico. The people in the neighborhood. There's a story of resurrection. And I can tell others. So it's not all bad. You know, it's not all doom and gloom. So that's the good news I want to leave you with. Okay. If it's okay, I'm going to go outside so I can greet people without a mask and I'll recognize you better.